Welcome back. The mission of the Economic Club of Chicago is to foster meaningful connections among Chicago leaders, to encourage dialogue on important social and economic issues, and to cultivate the next generation of civic leadership. Founded in 1927, the club has consistently provided a platform for global thought leaders to discuss economic, business, and social issues. The club provides a forum for discussion and debate and does not take position on issues. In keeping with the tradition of the club, our Questions Committee has gathered suggestions from senior leaders of Chicago to compile a list of thoughtful questions for our invited speaker, which we've given to our moderator today. Our moderator is fellow club member, entrepreneur, investor, and philanthropist, J.B. Pritzker. His business interests are varied. But perhaps most noticeable are his dedication and passion for building a robust technology sector in the Midwest. JB has played an essential role in the creation of many startups here in Chicago. He's co-founder and managing partner of Pritzker Group, a private investment firm with offices in Chicago and Los Angeles. Pritzker Group comprises 3 professional investment teams: middle market acquisitions, technology venture capital, and asset management. JB is an active civic leader and engaged board member of a number of cultural, educational, and business organizations. He's also the current first vice chairman of the Economic Club of Chicago. Welcome, JB. It's now my pleasure to introduce our honored speaker this evening. It has become clear in the months leading up to tonight that quite a few of you in the audience have personal connections to former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Born in Chicago and raised in Park Ridge, Secretary Clinton spent her formative years in the political and business environment of our great city. She returns to Chicago with a list of titles to her name, including former United States Senator, First Lady, and Secretary of State. The last position provided the basis for her second book, Hard Choices. Secretary Clinton has also recently had the pleasure of adding grandmother to her list of titles with the birth of her first grandchild, Charlotte, just over a week ago. With so much on our agenda, we are honored she could take the time to spend with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming back to the Economic Club of Chicago, former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton.
All right, so I'd like to get this question out of the way, frankly, before the television cameras really get rolling.
Are we just going to jump right into it?
Jump right in.
Okay. Can I say how happy I am to be here?
Would you?
And always glad to be back in Chicago. And thank John for the introduction, and Don and everybody who put this event together. And also to say right at the beginning, I have no idea what he's going to ask. So we're all in for a ride. Put on your seatbelts, Mr. Pritzker.
All right, next question. You served on the board of a Fortune 50 company. You were a partner at a law firm. You were First Lady of Arkansas. You were First Lady of the United States. You were United States Senator. You were United States Secretary of State. Your husband probably already knows the answer to this question, and your daughter probably already knows the answer to this question, and your high school friends who are here in the audience I've asked, and they seem to know the answer to this question. But I think we'd all like to hear it straight from you. Did it really all begin with a summer job de-sliming salmon in Alaska?
Well, we have to go a little further back than that. No, it all began here in Chicago and in Park Ridge. And my very first job, other than babysitting, was for the Park Ridge Park District. I was 13 years old. I was put in charge of a park that was about 3 miles from my house. At that time, my mother did not drive, and there was no way I could get back and forth except to put the volleyball and the games and the bats and all that in a wagon and pull it back and forth 3 miles each way for 3 hours, 3 days a week. So it really began back then. But fast forward, probably the job that has best prepared me for my later life was the job that I had for a brief period of time after my senior year in college, when I went with a group of friends to Alaska, and we were taking odd jobs as we traveled around that incredible, magnificent state. And one of the jobs that I took was sliming salmon. And sliming salmon is exactly as it sounds. You are handed a pair of hip boots and a rubber apron and a spoon. And the fish are dumped onto the dock off of the fishermen's boats, and at that time, the imported Japanese experts who were taking out the caviar would take out the caviar, then they would throw the fish into a big pile, and it was my job to take the fish and take the spoon and take out all the remaining guts in the salmon. And, I was a Girl Scout, and I did a lot of extra credit, as my friends from elementary and high school know, so I was really meticulous. I mean, I was scraping, and these men were screaming at me in Japanese. I had no idea what they were screaming about. And finally, they went to the American manager, and he came over and said, "You're not going fast enough." He said, "Just go faster." I said, "Okay." So, I'm trying to go faster and throwing them in. And finally, the Japanese went to the manager and said, "Too slow, too slow." So they kicked me upstairs. And upstairs was where you packed the salmon. And you had to pack them head, tail, head, tail, head, tail. And it was going down this little conveyor belt. This is my third day on the job. I knew nothing about fish, except these looked sick. I mean, they were kind of motley looking, and I'm packing them, and I go to the manager and I said, "Sir, I think some of these fish might be sick. Get back and just pack them." So a couple hours later, I say, "Some of them don't smell very good. Don't come to me, just do the job you're being paid for." So I came back the next day, and I finally said to him, I said, he said, "You're fired. You're absolutely fired." I said, "Well, I've worked 4 days." He said, "All right, come back tomorrow. We'll pay you for the 4 days." So I went back. The entire operation was gone. They'd packed it up, and they'd moved it out. So there are so many lessons in that 1 week of work in Valdez, Alaska, but I think that's probably the most formative job I've ever had.
And about that other question I was going to ask you.
Which one?
All right, we'll pass. But we'll come back to that one. So, on a much more serious topic, we're witnessing what feels like a tumultuous time in the history of our nation's foreign affairs. There's the rise of another terrorist state in the Middle East, the return of Russian aggression, China flexing its hegemony across Asia, and also its aggression and oppression against some of its own citizens. We have an Iran that's bound and determined to get a nuclear weapon. And we have a world that's growing smaller and smaller, and I think evidence of that is the Ebola crisis. So I guess in the context of all of that, what are the principles that guide you when you think about your worldview? How do those principles affect the way you think about the United States positioning and how we ought to play in the world in the next 20 years?
Well, that's obviously a sweeping and very critical question, and I would go back to the beginning of the first term for President Obama, because I think it's all too common for Americans. One of our great attributes is we're constantly thinking about moving forward in the future, but it does, I think, matter if we just pause and remember what President Obama inherited. And the Great Recession, 2 wars, both of which were not going all that well, was an overwhelming challenge when he walked into the White House on the first day. And in my discussions with him after he offered me the job here in Chicago, and I said no, and then I said no again, and I said no again, and finally I just gave in. And as I said somebody the other day, I told my husband no, and I wouldn't get married, and no, and just gave in. And so I have a history with charismatic, attractive men who just wear me out. And I think it was, in both instances, I would hasten to add, they were good decisions. But I think that when the president and I were talking about why he wanted me to be Secretary of State and what we had to do, a large part of it was trying to restore America's leadership position around the world, as well as beginning to make some very hard choices. I think we're in a time of tumult. I mean, on the one hand, even though you wouldn't know it from the headlines, the world is a lot safer, more prosperous. Great progress has been made. You look in our hemisphere compared to where we were 20, 30 years ago. You look at Asia, which has been producing great economic growth for its people. You look at the fact that 7 out of 10 of the fastest growing economies in the world now are in sub-Saharan Africa. There is a lot of good news, but because, as you say, we are so interconnected, that can produce threats and opportunities in ways that were just not part of our ongoing awareness even 10 or 20 years ago. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this euphoric belief that somehow we would all march together into a rosy future. And instead, what happened is that different countries that were following their own nationalistic agendas began to flex their muscles. Non-state groups, whether they were lethal operators like terrorist networks or criminal cartels, began to be able to use the technology we all benefit from to inflict harm and recruit others. So it is a very difficult set of factors that you have to evaluate as you make these hard choices, which is why I called my book that, because there is nothing that is self-evident. No matter how smart the people in the room, and there are a lot of smart people in this room, just like there are in government and other business opportunities around the world, you cannot have perfect information. And so when you list all of those problems, we're going to be continuing to face them. My hope is that we are a learning organism still, and we learn from what didn't work, and we try to avoid the mistakes of the past. And I know that's easier said than done, but I think that has to be the attitude that we all take as we move forward.
But is a guiding principle for you that we ought to be engaged in all of these conflicts, for example, in some fashion or another? In other words, is it our business, should we be involved in the, Putin's takeover of Crimea or the civil war, and I put that in quotes, in Ukraine? Is that our business? Should we be engaged in that? And then, of course, there's ISIL.
Right.
And What is our role there,
Right.
if not to get fully engaged? What is it?
Well, I think we do have to be engaged, but the challenge is how we define the terms of engagement at every turn. So you point to two particularly vexing problems. If the United States were not engaged, if President Obama had not worked assiduously with the Europeans to come up with a set of sanctions that at least forced Putin to have to respond, I think that would have been a mistake. I mean, if the United States said, you know, that's Europe, Ukraine isn't in NATO, let the Europeans take care of it, that was never going to work. It never has, and there was no reason to believe it would. In fact, I think we have to be smarter. That's why I like the phrase that I used as secretary and that I write about in my book. We have to use smart power. So when I became secretary, one of our objectives was to convince the Europeans that they needed to move toward energy independence so they were not dependent on Russian energy that had been used, and I argued would be used again to intimidate and threaten various countries in Europe. And the Europeans were kind of like, oh, you know, that was so then, this is now, we're not going to worry about that. And they didn't do enough quickly enough. Now they're struggling and scrambling to make up lost time. So yes, the United States has to be engaged, but the word engagement should never be in any way defined only by military action. That is not what engagement means. Military action should always be the last resort. So putting together the coalitions, creating sanctions, which is what we did with Iran to get Iran to the table. You know, we're not sure yet we're going to get a deal that we could live with, but when we started back in 2009, nobody thought we could get tough sanctions through the UN Security Council, and we carefully, deliberately built a case that even brought China and Russia along. If the United States is not engaged, if we do not lead, you can, in most instances, assume there will be either a vacuum that will be filled by either antagonists or non-state actors that can cause us problems down the road. Or if we don't lead, we possibly give an opening to others to try to take our place by forming their own coalitions. So yes, we have to be engaged, and by engagement I mean leadership, and that's what we've tried to do. Now, with respect to ISIL, this is a very serious threat, and here's why. It's a serious threat because this is the best funded, most professional, expansionist, jihadist military force that we've ever seen. This is far more advanced and far richer than Al-Qaeda ever was. And it now has established control over areas that straddle the border between Iraq and Syria. In many ways, this new entity, I refuse to call it the Islamic State. It is neither Islamic nor a state, and it should not be referred to as such. But this new entity, which is it is an inheritor of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had to be defeated by the United States, working with the Iraqis, primarily the Sunnis, 5-6 years ago. This entity poses a threat not only to the stability of Iraq and Syria, but also border areas in Turkey, and it has a potential ripple effect far beyond, and there is no doubt in my mind that it will attempt to launch attacks against Western targets if it has the ability to do so. I think the administration and certainly the strategy that the president outlined, again, was absolutely essential in order to get anybody else on board. You know, if the United States had said, you know, this is regrettable, we hate seeing people beheaded on YouTube, somebody please go do something about it, well, nobody would. There's just no one else who will step into that leadership role. So instead, What the president and the administration did was to say, first we have to get rid of Maliki, who has been the principal antagonist to the Sunnis and to the Kurds, and allowed the ground to be seeded by the mistreatment of Sunnis with resentments that led them to either take an active role in supporting ISIL originally, or to step aside and let ISIL take over Mosul and keep rolling forward. That was accomplished. Again, no one else could have accomplished it. And a new government was installed. No one else can try to lead the rebuilding of the Iraqi military. We are getting some help from some of our allies, but it has to be Americans who had pre-existing relationships. And nobody else could have put together a coalition of Arab and European and Canadian fighter jets and refueling tankers and other Air Force capabilities than the United States. So, of course, there will have to be a reconstituted Iraqi force, primarily Sunnis and the Peshmerga from Kurdistan, that will take on the day-to-day fighting as they're doing on the border of Turkey now. But the role that the military can play and the symbolic importance of having Arab fighters, one of them, as you know, from the UAE, and a woman major in the Emirati Air Force, at least demonstrates that this is not just the US, this is a broader coalition that is absolutely revolted by the behavior of these criminals, and that they're going to pay a price. None of that would have happened in the absence of American leadership. So engagement leads to leadership, which can lead to political and diplomatic and humanitarian, as well as military tactics.
But our closest allies that joined the coalition all had votes in their parliaments over the use of force. Here in the United States, we did not. You served in the Congress. Don't you think that the Congress should have debated or should debate and vote on the use of force?
Well, I think that there will be some kind of legislative action. Exactly how it will be defined when they come back will be obviously up to the Congress and in consultation with the White House. But remember, our Congress was not chomping at the bit to have a vote. They could not wait to get out of town. They did not want the responsibility of voting yes or voting no. They wanted to get on the campaign trail. You know, I understand that. I don't like it, but I certainly understand it. So before we get too worked up about whether or not we should have had a vote, let's see what happens after this election when the Congress is back and when there will be an opportunity for them to take a vote. And there are a lot of variations on what kind of vote they can take if they so choose to do so. You know, I was obviously involved in a number of actions that we debated as to whether or not they triggered the War Powers Act, whether or not they were authorized already by the authorization to use military force, which was passed back in 2001, when we had to notify the Congress, who we had to notify. So there's a constant debate within the administration about what should or should not be presented to the Congress, and I think there are a number of members of Congress who've been speaking out saying, you know, look, we should have a role in this. And remember, though, too, most of our allies in this particular effort are either monarchies that order, you will fly those F-18s, you will be part of this air war, or they are parliamentary democracies where the government has the majority. So I was in Ottawa 2 days ago in the midst of the parliamentary debate in Canada, and the Conservative government of Prime Minister Harper was making the case, and they had a very clear set of parameters: in for 6 months, 6 fighters, you know, on and on. They laid it all out. The entire opposition voted against them, but they had enough votes, so it was preordained what the outcome would be. So I think that there is more complexity and uncertainty in our system than some of these other systems that we can look at from the outside. But there will be debate, and there may even, if the Congress wishes to actually be recorded, there may be a vote.
So uncertainty is right in our system. You experienced in the 1990s divided government. We all did. There was a government shutdown even back then too. But somehow some major pieces of legislation got passed with a fully Republican Congress and a Democratic president, like a balanced budget and welfare reform and a few other things. Why is the current relationship between the Congress and the president so much more dysfunctional, and what do we need to do?
Well, I think that there are a number of similarities and some differences. The similarities are in the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, just like in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, really significant legislation was passed. So in the Clinton administration, it was deficit reduction, which raised taxes, as some of you, I'm sure, remember. It was taking on the NRA and outlawing assault weapons. It was passing NAFTA. It was quite a list, as Bill Daley remembers, because he was whipping the votes for NAFTA. And similarly, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, dealing with the stimulus, trying to save the economy from further collapse, passing the Affordable Care Act. I mean, significant, important legislation. And the other similarity is that both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama lost the Congress in the first midterm election. Because when you do something as big as trying to reduce the deficit or provide affordable health care, those who are worried about change will always have greater intensity than those who may down the road benefit from change. So it was very difficult in 1994 to say to people, hey, you know what, we passed a crime bill that outlawed assault weapons, but we're not going to be taking away your shotguns and your rifles and your pistols. And oh, by the way, the deficit reduction is actually going to stimulate the economy. We will start growing. We will create 22 million new jobs in the next 6 years. People said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. All I know is you raised my gas tax, or you raised the corporate tax, or you took assault weapons off the street. And with President Obama, it was, okay, fine, you're stimulating the economy, but I don't have my job back. Unemployment is still unacceptably high. And this healthcare thing that you passed, who knows whether that's going to help me or not. So the similarities are pretty stark. And shutting down the government, both for Bill in 95, 96, and for President Obama in 2013, drew some really sharp lines between the parties. I think that the willingness of some in the Congress to default on our debt or to shut down the government is the kind of irresponsible politicking that does a grave disservice to our democracy. So I think that you look at the similarities and you can see that when a president tries to do what he said he would do, deficit reduction, healthcare reform, and sets about doing it, it is often going to run into really hard political opposition. And if you are successful, you and your allies may pay a political price. I think what's different is that back in the 90s, as challenging as it was, as some of you remember, there were still leaders on the other side of the aisle who understood the responsibility of governing. Newt Gingrich would spend all day, every day, attacking Bill, and sometimes me, all over the TV. And then at 9 o'clock at night, he'd come over to the White House, and he'd go up to the second floor, and he and Bill would try to hammer out the details for deals. Okay, so what is it that is acceptable to me that you would be willing to pass in the Congress on welfare reform, for example? How are we going to try to move toward a balanced budget? And there were enough people who had sort of the muscle memory of real legislating that you could make deals. I got to tell you, there should be absolutely no reason in our system to be opposed or even revolted by the idea of compromise. Compromise is at the core of a democracy, because unless you think that you have a divine mandate and therefore you are in the party of divinity, no human being has all the answers. And we do better when we listen to each other, try to understand the perspective of each other, and reach an honorable compromise. And it is deeply distressing to me that we have people running for Congress, both the House and the Senate, who proudly go around their districts and their states proclaiming that you should send them to Washington because they will never compromise. I don't care whether you're a liberal Democrat or a really conservative Republican, do not vote for people who do not believe in compromise, because they do not believe in the legislative process of a democracy. And I think, JB, it certainly has gotten more intense in lots of ways, partly because with the advances in technology, with social media, with instantaneous connection, people are more informed than maybe they were back in the 90s. But the basic problem is we've lost leaders on both sides of the aisle, particularly at this point in our history on the other side of the aisle, who are more interested in governing than in posturing. More interested in problem solving than in partisanship. And the only way to solve this is for the American people, the American voters, people who contribute to campaigns, who constitute the great middle of the American political system, to just call a halt to it. And the final thing I would say is I think we saw this in action back in the fall of 2013 when there was a move to default on our debt, which just was beyond the understanding of most leaders in business and government around the world. They were contacting me. I was reading what they were saying. They're saying, you can't be serious, really? People are going to default on the debt of the United States government? Well, what are they thinking? And then they shut the government down, denying the president the opportunity to go to the East Asia Summit, which is something we had negotiated carefully to be part of. Well, he couldn't go. The government was shut down. The people who organize and operate a presidential trip couldn't come to work. So the President of the United States was prevented from going and being in the most consequential region of the world for the future. You could not have made Vladimir Putin happier. He and Xi Jinping were thrilled that President Obama was not there. And I don't care what party you are, Democrats never did that to George W. Bush, despite our deep differences with President Bush on taxes, on Iraq, on so many other things. Never did it. And so you have to ask yourself, do these particular members of Congress really understand the world, understand what it means for the United States to lead and to be perceived as a leader? Or do they just not care? Do they just have a whole other agenda that enables them to say whatever they want to say and spout whatever rhetoric they want to spout? And that's why it's imperative that you have people in business and other positions of responsibility basically saying, you know what, I'm conservative, but I'm not radical. I don't want to break up the most effective governing system in the history of the world. I don't want to make us look weak in front of our adversaries. Get out there and do your job. Stay off the talk shows. Get back to the Congress, legislate, and solve America's problems.
Well, we're here in front of the Economic Club, and so I thought it would be a good idea if we switched gears a little bit and talked about, well, what do you know, the economy and your view on job creation. Your father built a small business, actually here in Chicago, and I discovered it was based in the Merchandise Mart at one point, right about where 1871 is located, and that's our new tech center here. And it dawned on me that that experience growing up with a father and building a business might have some impact on your view of the role of government and taxes in the creation of jobs, in the growing of businesses. So I guess I want to ask, what do you believe the government's role is? How expansive or limited should the government's role be in the creation of jobs and economic growth in the United States?
Well, when you were asking the question, I was thinking about when I was a really little girl, and my father did have an office in the Merchandise Mart, and he would sometimes take me down there, and it was just a one-room office. He had a very small operation, but when I was in the office with him, there was a window that was open. It was, before air conditioning and such luxuries. So he told me that there was a wolf, a huge wolf that lived in the river. And if I leaned too far out the window, the wolf might leap up and grab me in order to keep me away from the window. And that is my most vivid memory of the Merchandise Mart. He also later had a small printing plant.
By the way, we do have a wolf at...
Do you?
It's Howard Tullman at 1871.
And there's Howard, I see him. My father had a small printing plant, very, very small, and he only had like one worker, and then he would hire day laborers, and my mother and my brothers and I would help to actually do the silk screen printing on the table of the drapery fabrics that he sold. So for me, I grew up watching my father build a small business that provided a very comfortable living for my mother, my brothers, and I. Had a nice house on a corner in Park Ridge, went to great public schools in Park Ridge, had the Park District and so many other opportunities. And it was all tied to this very basic ethic of individual responsibility, working hard, making the most of yourself, getting a good education. But it was always coupled with what the implicit promise was, that if you worked hard, you did your part, there would be opportunities for you. And, I learned early on that that wasn't true for everybody, because through my church, we started partnerships with churches in the city, predominantly African American, and others that were Hispanic. And there were a lot of kids that I met who were as hardworking and as motivated as I felt I was, but the opportunities might not have been as easily available in those days, despite their own efforts. So I came of age at a time where I believed totally in being my own person, and my parents were great in never drawing distinctions. Girls don't do that, or girls shouldn't do that. That was not in their vocabulary. So as we got into the 60s and the Civil Rights Revolution and the women's movement and all the rest of that, that thread of opportunity and upward mobility became at least more possible for greater numbers of people, despite gender or race or ethnicity. But I never doubted that eventually more and more Americans would have the kind of opportunities that I was raised believing should be available. What's happened now is that an unfortunately large segment of our population doubts that. So for me, jobs are not just about how we create jobs. It's about how we renew that confidence and that belief in the opportunity and the upward mobility that I think was probably a part of most of the lives of the people in this room over the course of the last 40+ years. I think the government has a role to play. I think the government should play a role. A lot of the research and development that we now take for granted, from the internet to GPS, was a result of tax dollars being invested and producing outcomes that then could be commercialized. Public education, both at the public school level, at the college and university level, was one of our great advantages, which we are not as confident about now, and we need to understand that if we don't rebuild and reinvest, we will perhaps not have the opportunities as broadly available as they should be. So I think every generation faces different issues. I personally think Franklin Roosevelt made the right choice, putting people to work in the time of a Great Depression. That was no longer necessary by the time World War II ended, but look what Dwight Eisenhower, a conservative man, a Republican, did when he decided to build the interstate highway system, investing in infrastructure, building the airport system. So we have to be, we can't be imprisoned by ideology, and we have to do a better job of looking at what works, looking at the evidence of what works. So from my perspective today, I think we are making a very big mistake not investing in infrastructure today. Interest rates could not be lower. And to invest in what is possible to build and make us more competitive will pay dividends far into the future. I gave a speech this morning to the medical technology, medical device trade group. Among their worries, one of their biggest, is that the FDA is just so slow. Well, with sequestering federal funds, the FDA doesn't have the personnel to be able to expedite American innovation in medical technology. That costs us money, that costs us jobs. It costs us investment, it costs us exports. I think if you go through the list of what works to create jobs right now and what needs to be invested in today in order to make sure we have jobs tomorrow, it is, as it always has been in this country, a public-private partnership. We need to figure out how to repatriate the $2 trillion that is sitting offshore that American businesses have parked around the world, instead of bringing it back and putting it to work right here. Building plants in the United States instead of in the countries abroad where the money is being warehoused. I mean, there's just a lot of issues that if we could work together again, if we could listen to each other, if we could actually learn from each other and not go into any conversation believing that, we or the other side was right or wrong, I think we could begin to spark more job creation. But I would end by saying we are currently the envy of the world. Our economy is doing better. I believe that the very hard choices the president and his economic team made early on in the administration laid the groundwork both to prevent worse economic consequences and to begin the climb out of the deep hole we were in. And now the rest of the world, the IMF just basically said we're the only country growing with projected robust growth. Let's take advantage of that. Let's figure out how we're going to have the kind of partnership between business and government that previous generations of Americans did that will position us to continue to grow the economy and to begin creating more jobs for more people now, so that we can see employment rise and get people, out of the no longer looking for work category.
I just want to bring up a topic that you and I share deep passion for, and that's early childhood development. I view this, by the way, as an economic issue. I really, this isn't a bleeding heart liberal, let's do it for the little children kind of an issue. To me, this is about it's about our economic growth, competitiveness, et cetera. You've talked about this issue from a different perspective, and that was, and I don't know the story, but it's but around your mother and her experiences as a young child, and that's what drew you to the topic to begin with. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also your views about it as an economic issue?
Well, I've always been very interested in early childhood development, and I never quite understood exactly why I was so drawn to it, over even my younger years of schooling, until it sort of clicked for me that my mother, who was born in Chicago to teenage parents, had such a childhood of abuse and neglect and abandonment because they divorced when she and her younger sister were very young, and neither her mother or her father wanted the girls. And so they put her on put them, the two little girls alone, on a train in Chicago to go by themselves to Los Angeles, where they would be picked up by their paternal grandparents. And when I first learned that story, I couldn't even digest it. I thought, who puts, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old alone on a train? Who abandons their children in their, tenement apartment for days with not enough food to eat? It just didn't register on me, because obviously I thought my mother was terrific and taking very good care of us. And then she got to California, and her paternal grandparents were very mean-spirited and not nurturing at all. And eventually, when she was 13, she had to leave and go to work in somebody else's house in order to support herself. And the deal was she would take care of those kids, get them off to school, and then she could go to high school, and then she would have to come back and take care of them. And she did all of that, but she got to graduate from high school and never got to go to college. But I remember asking her at one point, after I was older and kind of processing this, how did you turn out the way you did? Because her sister was, not so lucky. And, my mother said, all along the way, somebody showed kindness toward me. The teacher in the classroom who noticed I never had anything to eat, who would bring an extra carton of milk and then say, oh my gosh, Dorothy, I have too much to eat. Here, have my milk and a half a sandwich. Never embarrassing her, never making her feel like she was unworthy, but showing kindness. And the woman whose house she worked in, noticing she had one blouse and one skirt that she washed every night, saying, oh, I can't wear this anymore. Maybe you could wear it. I mean, something that would sort of trigger a sense of possibility, of hope, and giving my mother the chance to learn how to navigate the adult world and to know, by watching this family she was working in, what a loving family looked like, what it meant for parents to take care of kids. So I was always fascinated about what went on in those early years, and why are some children who are subjected to the same kind of mistreatment crushed and broken, and others maybe injured but capable of moving forward. And so when I was at Yale Law School, I took an extra year at the Yale Child Study Center, studying child development and working at the Yale New Haven Hospital with the medical school on child abuse. So fast forward, it's always been something that I cared deeply about, because we wring our hands about problems in our schools, problems in our workforce, difficulties young people have in our country, 6 million between 18 and 24 out of work or out of school. But for me, it all starts in those earliest years, what kind of support and care you get. So when I was First Lady, we had the first White House Conference on Early Childhood Development, and there was some really interesting beginning brain research. Well, fast forward to today, we know that it's not only a nice thing to read to your child, nurture your child, sing, talk, interact with your child. You are literally building the brain. So many of the problems that poor kids or other neglected kids have when they get to school is they're so far behind in vocabulary acquisition and in brain development that can only come from that human interaction that it's really hard, no matter how dedicated the teachers, no matter how rich the curriculum, for kids to make up for all that loss. And that's why I really appreciate what you and MK do, because you've always understood that early childhood education, and really from 0 to 3, and then from 3 to 5, because there's 2 different phases, is not only a really nice thing to do, it is an educational and economic imperative. When my grandchild, for example, or your children or grandchildren show up in kindergarten, they will have heard 30 million more words than a poor child who shows up in kindergarten. You would also, if you did brain scans in kindergarten, see that the complexity of brain development would be greater in the children who'd heard 30 million more words. So when we think about, okay, how do we tackle education and economic competitiveness, we, I think, make a mistake starting just in formal schooling. We really have to do a better job of reaching out to families. That's what I'm doing at the Clinton Foundation, as you know, because we've worked together in an initiative called Too Small to Fail. We are trying to inject into the sort of social bloodstream the very simple, inexpensive idea that talk, read, and sing to your child because you are teaching your child. You're building brain cells, you're building neural connections, and you're laying the groundwork for educational achievement. So this is, for me, those first 5 years of life, one of the most important commitments we could make if we expect to remain economically competitive and successful.
Before I ask you the last question of the evening, I do want to say on behalf of the Economic Club of Chicago, on behalf of everyone in attendance here tonight, on my own behalf also, a thank you, and maybe just as importantly, we want you to know that you are always welcome home to Chicago and here at the Economic Club. So I lied, I really have 2 questions. One is, has President Clinton actually changed a diaper yet on your granddaughter?
Oh boy, I'm going to get in trouble whichever way I answer this one. I don't think so. However, our son-in-law has. And so I think that we're making generational progress.
All right, final question, quick answer, Cubs or Sox?
Okay. I am a Cubs fan. Now, I have to tell you, I believe that just as sliming fish prepared me for life, so does being a Cubs fan. Year in and year out. when I was a little girl, I quickly caught on that being a Cubs fan was more of a tenet of religious faith than any kind of passing fancy. Once a Cubs fan, always a Cubs fan. But my personality was such that I couldn't stay hitched only to a losing team. And I couldn't, with all due respect to my dear friends from my childhood who are rabid Sox fans, I could not become a Sox fan. So I had to search for a team that would counterbalance the experience of losing every single year. So I hate to say this, and I know you'll probably boo me, I became a Yankees fan. So there I was when I was like 8 years old, and I loved the Cubs, watched WGN every game I could, went to Wrigley Field with my father when I was young, and then with my friends. Actually, one morning, we were at the breakfast table, and my father got up early every morning and read the paper. And so one of my brothers came down to breakfast, and my father said, "Well, how was school yesterday?" My brother said, "Oh, fine." "Well, what'd you do in school?" "Ah, same old stuff." "Really? Well, look at this." And there was a picture in the Tribune of my youngish brother, junior high school age, and his friends at Wrigley Field for opening day. So, I mean, we were very devoted, but I, alternated my affections because it was just too hard only being a Cubs fan, but absolutely a Cubs fan. And someday, it will happen.
Thank you very much for being here.
Secretary Clinton, on behalf of the Economic Club of Chicago, Secretary Clinton, thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it. JB, terrific job moderating. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming.